The American runs about 1,500 miles from the Mississippi River to California. That's what traditionally historians have considered the American West. It's 1 billion acres, over 1.5 million inhabitants lived there at the time following the Civil War. So that's the period we're looking at. You can see on the map here, and this is from an 1820 map, it was called the Great American Desert, and you can see the words there, Great American Desert, and it kind of kept that name. It had been called that before, and there wasn't many trees there on the plains, and many people thought that without trees it was the desert. And I mentioned that in a previous lecture, that if they thought if you had trees, you had rain. That's not exactly the way it works, but that was the way they believed. It was also, the American West was also home to about 12 million head of American buffalo. They were in two breeds, the northern herd and the southern herd, and they roamed the plains. People describe them as being like a brown ocean as they swept and migrated over the plains eating food. And the buffalo were very important to the people who lived in this region, and that was Native Americans. Now, most Native Americans at this time, following the Civil War, lived on the plains, about 2/3 of them. Some of them were from the east, and they had been pushed west as Americans had begun moving further and further west. Others lived there. They were like the Pueblo Indians out in the Four Corners region, or they were maybe semi-nomadic, like the Apache and the Navajo, who also were shepherds. And then, of course, the ones that we're more familiar with were the ones on horse, like the Comanche and the Dakota Sioux. So there were different types of Native Americans in the West. There were a lot of similarities, but there were a lot of differences. In fact, probably more differences than similarities. Although we can say that generally most Native Americans in the West were very independent. They chose, we tend to think of them as tribes, but that's not exactly. Might follow a leader, and as soon as they lost faith in that leader, they wouldn't follow him anymore. They were fierce warriors, and most of them made their livings through the hunt. And by livings, I'm talking about their livelihoods. It's not necessarily what they did for money, but what they did to survive. And they lived off the buffalo and using the horse. So these two economies, as they're sometimes called, the buffalo was the tool making, for shelter, for clothing. They used everything. Also, they made adequate use of the horse, maybe even more than adequate. They were some of the finest horsemen. The Comanches have been called some of the lightest light cavalrymen, and that was by U.S. Army observers. The men of most of the tribes concerned with hunting and with conducting warfare, while the women did the household chores as well as farming. Children, rather interesting, they didn't want their children to dislike the parents. They thought that was a great dishonor. And so children were raised by relatives or by their brothers and sisters, so that if they got punished, it wasn't going to be their parents, it was going to be somebody else. Up until the time of the Civil War, there were several policies that Native Americans were subject to by the United States government. Beginning about the 1820s, there was a removal policy. And what they wanted to do, the federal government wanted to move Indians, and you see this in the Trail of Tears of the 1830s, and you also see it further in the Northeast. They wanted to move them. In the West, they had one big reservation policy. Usually this was where the Dakotas are now, where the Dakota Sioux live. This idea of a big reservation, but they also started coming up with other reservations. 1851, the so-called concentration policy, they wanted to put them into specific areas, and this was either in the Lakota area, what we call now the Dakotas, Wyoming, Montana, North and South Dakota, or in what we would call now Oklahoma, Indian Territory. In 1867, the federal government started a new policy, and this was the so-called Grant's Peace Policy. And what they wanted to do was to, they might say, civilize the Indians. This was looked after by Quaker Indian commissioners, and it's sometimes called the Quaker Peace Policy or the Indian Peace Commission. The Bureau of Indian Affairs was inaugurated to establish and to administer the reservations and to oversee their daily operations, and this was all concluded in the First Medicine Lodge Treaty. In 1887, we tried to turn Indians into farmers, and this is maybe a further example of Americanization. And we parceled it out to individual Indians. This was the Dawes Severalty Act. And what this did was it gave to Native American men, head of households, 160 acres, which was very similar to the Homestead Act, except that the Native Americans themselves weren't trusted to own the land on their own. They felt that they had to be administered for them by the federal government. It's a very paternalistic ideology. And so they held the land in trust. The federal government held the land in trust for 25 years, and the Native Americans could get access to it after that. It would be their land. And many ranchers and farmers, Anglo ranchers and farmers, would come onto reservation land and lease land from individual Indians. In Pennsylvania, there was a industrial school established for Native American children. This is called the Carlisle Academy, the Carlisle Institute. The Carlisle Indian Industrial School was the official name, and here you have a picture of several Native American students studying there. And again, this was an attempt to Americanize the Native Americans, Americanize the Indian. Colonel Pratt, who was in charge of the Carlisle Academy, Richard Pratt, made a statement to some funders at the time, and he said, we're here to kill the Indian and save the white man. He believed that, and he was telling his supporters that, inside every Indian is a white man waiting to get out, essentially. And if they just needed to get rid of the Indian part and save the white man. Again, very paternalistic, almost stereotypical, maybe even racist thought, but that was very common at the time. On the other hand, Native Americans did attempt to maintain their own culture, despite the fact that there were many attempts at Americanization, and they saw themselves kind of dying out. They participated in rodeos and cattle raising, which reminded them of their days hunting, so they draw some parallels between that. They raised sheep. They were given ration cattle. They were given so many cattle if they were on the reservation, and sometimes they would have hunts with those cattle to go back and feel like they were hunting buffalo again. So they did attempt to maintain their culture, although their language in many cases was being wiped out. Their children were taught English at the schools, and again, many were dying off, so there was a fear that the Native Americans would disappear. Between 1875 and 1877, there were a series of conflicts. One of the most popular ones, I say popular, was the most well-known ones, was the Sioux Wars. And this started, like I say, about 1875 and ran to about 1877. Just 2 years, but it was a very tumultuous 2 years. Probably the best known examples are Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, two chiefs of the Lakota Sioux. And the most famous incident happened really right before America celebrated her centennial, her 100 years of independence. On June 25th, 1876, in northern Wyoming, the Wyoming-Montana border, they had the Battle of the Little Bighorn. And this is where General George A. Custer and the 7th Cavalry were ordered out and were trying to patrol and get Indians back onto the reservation. And there on the Black Hills, they ran into several thousand Native American men who were waiting for them, and the 7th Cavalry was wiped out. News trickled back to Washington, D.C. on July 4th. And this instituted a change from the Quaker peace policy to one of extreme force of trying to get the Indians back on the reservation almost with any means possible. Crazy Horse, Sitting Bull were arrested, were killed by Indian tribal police, by other Indians. So there was a lot of conflict, and it caused a lot of disruption in the West, and certainly the defeat of an American Army regiment caused a lot of internal problems for Americans in their dealings with Native Americans. In 1877, the Nez Perce Indians of the West Coast were being moved from another reservation. They were going to be moved into Washington State. And Chief Joseph, who's pictured here, led a resistance, about 200 warriors and several hundred more women, children, and elderly men who didn't want to go to this new reservation, and so they were trying to escape the United States and get into Canada, and they made tremendous time. They traveled over 1,300 miles in just a few months, walking. They were eventually caught by the army and brought back, and Chief Joseph, made a speech saying that, everybody's dying, people are starving, and he doesn't see any need to continue the resistance. And he says, from where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever. And this has become a famous line and a symbol of the decline and the end of Indian resistance. But there was still more resistance going on. For example, in the Southwest, Apache Indians had been fighting for several years, almost since the beginning of the Civil War, and this lasted almost 2 decades. In 1872, Cochise, their chief, agreed to peace in exchange if they could stay on a reservation in the Arizona area, their traditional lands. However, their most famous medicine man, he wasn't a war chief, he was actually a medicine man, but Geronimo refused to go on the reservation, and he continued to fight until 1886. And when he and his men were finally defeated, they were taken to Florida by train and then to other parts back to Fort Sill, so they weren't even allowed to go back to traditional reservation land. The Comanche Wars of 1871 to 1875 included parts of Texas. General Phil Sheridan, formerly of the Civil War, was now in charge of Indian affairs in the West. And many Texans were complaining that they needed more security on the frontier because of Indian raids. And Sheridan decided he was going to go on a tour and inspect the various forts in western Texas. And he made it all the way up to Fort Griffin, up in north of Dallas, and said, well, we didn't really see many Indians, and those that we did caused no problems. Well, a few hours after he got into the fort, news of a massacre came in. And this was the so-called Warren Wagon Train Massacre, where about 7 muleteers were killed by Indians who had watched Sheridan and his men, many of them Buffalo soldiers, ride around but didn't want to engage the army and determined to attack the next wagon train. And the Warren wagon train was the unfortunate victims of that. And so Sheridan calls for all-out warfare, again, putting the Indian resistance down by any means necessary. In 1874, the Battle of Adobe Walls in far northern Texas, up in the Panhandle, north of Amarillo. This is where the Apaches attacked the settlement out there. Adobe Walls was a trading post. They were attacked, and they were able to fight off the Native American attackers. But this put a new Indian leader in everyone's gun sight, and that was a man named Quanah Parker. Quanah Parker was the child of Cynthia Ann Parker and Pettinacona. Pettinacona had married Cynthia Ann Parker, who had been abducted by an Indian tribe. He eventually marries her, and they have several children, and she is captured, and Petta is killed up around the Red River north of Fort Worth. And she eventually dies a couple of years later. They try to reunite her, but she is pretty much has adopted Indian culture and so isn't willing to go back to Anglo ways. In 1875, Quanah Parker, the last chief of this Apache band, finally surrendered, and this marks much of the end of the Indians. But the final coup d'etat, as it were, on December 29th of 1890, at Wounded Knee, South Dakota, the remnants, what was left of the 7th Cavalry, reformed 7th Cavalry, attacked a band of ghost dancers. The ghost dance had started in Nevada, and it was led by a holy man named Wovoka. He was a prophet of the Paiute Indians in California and Nevada area, and he began the ghost dance. And he said with the ghost dance of Indians had lost their faith, and that's why they were seeing a decline in their power and in their people. And he said that if Indians would do the ghost dance and renew their vision and their faith, the fathers who had gone before them would come back and restore their power. Well, the ghost dance spread from reservation to reservation, and many reservation officials were afraid that something would happen, and so they oftentimes called in troops to stop ghost dancers on the reservation. And this happened at the Lakota Reservation in Sioux Territory. The dancers fled, they ran away, and on December 29th of 1890, the 7th Cavalry, trying to get retribution for what had happened to Custer, that's still fresh on their minds, attacked and used Hotchkiss machine guns to mow down a band of basically old men and women and children who were encamped there at Wounded Knee, South Dakota. And this is a picture of Bigfoot, who was one of the elder chiefs who was left behind. Many of the ghost dancers didn't fear bullets. They thought that the ghost dance would make them invulnerable to weapons, and of course they were sadly mistaken in that. His body was left overnight frozen in the snow, and this was a picture that they took of the massacre site afterwards. So the Native Americans of the American West, by 1890, the resistance was over. They had returned to the reservation, what was left of them, and their numbers were dwindling rapidly. And what led to the conquest? Well, Army pressure, certainly, and Army weapons. The destruction of the buffalo herds also played a large role in this. Also, as railroads brought more and more settlers into the West, and other settlers came in looking for ranch land and farming land, Western settlement and railroads also led, because many of the people on the railroads were brought in to hunt buffalo, because buffalo stopped the railroads. And so buffalo were seen as pests, and railroads hired men to shoot buffalo, these buffalo hunters, like the most famous one, Buffalo Bill Cody. And finally, attempts to Americanize Native Americans through the Dawes Severalty Act, through the Carlisle Indian School, and other efforts at making Native Americans into Americans.